My name is Mark Bell. I'm in my late 30s. I work in finance, not the flashy, loud kind people imagine, but the quiet, spreadsheet-heavy kind where precision matters more than charisma. I'm a husband, a soon-to-be homeowner, or at least I thought I was, and for most of my adult life, I've been the person people describe with words like reliable, steady, and easygoing, the kind of man who doesn't make waves. Most people underestimate me, not because I'm incapable, but because I don't advertise myself. I don't raise my voice in rooms full of louder personalities. I don't dominate conversations. I listen. I observe. I take notes mentally, even when no one realizes I'm paying attention. That quietness often gets mistaken for softness, or worse, naivety. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about humiliating anyone or watching someone crash and burn. There's no shouting, no dramatic confrontations, no cinematic villains. What happened to me unfolded slowly, quietly, in ways that didn't look dangerous until the damage was already done. It's the story of how my own brother used my social security number to open 3 credit cards, and how I didn't find out in a dramatic argument or a police station, but in the most ordinary, bureaucratic way imaginable, when my mortgage application was denied. That denial letter changed everything, not because of what it said, but because of what it revealed. This is a story about family dynamics that people don't like to talk about roles that get assigned early and never questioned, about how being the dependable one can slowly turn into being the exploited one without anyone ever saying it out loud. And it's about what happens when silence stops being a personality trait and starts becoming a deliberate choice. I want to be very clear about something. I'm not telling this story to paint myself as a hero or my brother as a monster. Real life isn't that clean. People justify what they do. Families normalize things that would look outrageous from the outside. And sometimes the most harmful betrayals come wrapped in familiarity and trust. This is a story about awareness, about documentation, about patience, about choosing not to explode emotionally, and instead letting reality do the talking. Over the course of this story, you'll hear how small dismissals turned into patterns, how I slowly realized the role I had been assigned in my own family, how I learned to stop explaining myself to people who benefited from misunderstanding me, and how quiet, lawful, deliberate decisions can change power dynamics without anyone raising their voice. There's no fantasy here, no sudden luck, no miracle turnaround, just consequences, arriving exactly when they're supposed to. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something, gently and honestly. Have you ever stayed quiet to keep the peace, only to realize later that the peace was never mutual? To my family, I was the easy one, not the successful one, not the charismatic one, not the one people worried about or bragged about. I was the one who had it together, which is family language for doesn't need much. The one you could count on to show up early, stay late, help quietly, and never ask for anything in return. Growing up, my older brother was the story. Louder, sharper edges, bigger emotions. He took up space the way some people naturally do, as the room adjusted itself around him. When something went wrong, there was always an explanation ready. Stress, bad luck, someone else's fault. Everyone understood. Everyone adjusted. I learned early that my role wasn't to compete for attention. It was to reduce friction. At family gatherings, I was the one refilling drinks while conversations happened around me. The one listening to complaints without adding my own. The one who could be trusted with logistics, booking, planning, fixing, because I wouldn't complicate things with feelings. People mistook that for contentment. If I ever tried to explain how I felt, it landed awkwardly, like a language no one wanted to translate. "You're fine," they'd say, half laughing. "You're the stable one," as if stability meant immunity, as if being calm meant being untouched. So I stopped explaining. Over time, something subtle happened. Requests stopped being requests. They became assumptions. I'd volunteered before I agreed. My yes was preloaded into conversations I wasn't even part of. And because I didn't object loudly, no one noticed the line crossing. Invisibility isn't dramatic. It doesn't arrive with cruelty. It arrives with convenience. At work, it was similar. I wasn't the guy pitching big ideas in meetings. I was the guy whose numbers everyone relied on once the meeting was over. When things went right, it was teamwork. When something went wrong, it was a quiet fix. Handled, absorbed, forgotten. I internalized the message. Be useful. Don't be heavy. And for a long time, that worked. Or at least I thought it did. What I didn't realize was that being seen as dependable slowly stripped me of boundaries in other people's minds. Dependability became permission. Silence became consent. My calm demeanor became a blank check that others felt entitled to cash, especially family. My brother and I weren't close in the sentimental way people expect siblings to be. We didn't share deep talks or inside jokes. Our relationship was built on familiarity, not intimacy. He knew my habits. I knew his patterns. We didn't interfere with each other's lives. At least, that's what I believed. Looking back, I see the imbalance more clearly. He borrowed things without asking. Money, once or twice, which he always paid back late but with a story attached. I didn't push. He joked about my boring lifestyle, about how cautious I was. Everyone laughed. I smiled. I let it slide. Because that was my role. I was the one who didn't react. And here's the dangerous part. When you don't react, people start testing how far that goes. Not consciously at first. It's incremental. A small overstep. A bigger one. Each time they wait to see if there's resistance. There wasn't. From the outside, my life looked uneventful. Stable job, clean credit, predictable routines. I paid my bills on time. I tracked my finances meticulously, not out of fear, but out of habit. I believed order was a form of self-respect. What I didn't know was that while I was being perceived as invisible, I was also being used as something else entirely. But at this stage of the story, I didn't feel wronged. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel suspicious. I just felt unseen. And when you're unseen for long enough, you start believing that's all you're meant to be. That belief is what made everything that followed possible. The first sign didn't feel like a betrayal. It barely even registered as a problem. It was a comment, offhand, casual, delivered with a laugh. We were at my parents' place for a weekend dinner. Plates half cleared. The kind of evening where conversations overlap and no one is really listening closely. My brother was telling a story about sorting out some credit nonsense, waving his hand like it was an annoying fly. He looked at me and said, "Man, you're lucky. Your credit's probably perfect. You're so boring." Everyone laughed. I smiled. I always did. At the time, it felt harmless. Sibling teasing. A throwaway joke. But something about the way he said your credit lingered. Not enough to alarm me. Just enough to file away. A mental note without urgency. I've learned since then that intuition rarely screams. It whispers. A few weeks later, I noticed a soft pull on my credit monitoring app. Nothing dramatic. One inquiry. It could have been anything. Pre-approval spam, a background check glitch, a typo. These things happen. I work in finance. I know not every alert is a crisis. Still, I checked the details. The name on the inquiry wasn't a lender I recognized. It wasn't tied to any application I'd made. The address listed was mine, but the phone number wasn't. That gave me pause. I told myself not to overthink it. That's the thing about being the rational one. You're very good at explaining away discomfort. You become your own defense attorney against suspicion. You want evidence before emotion, proof before accusation. So I let it go. A month passed, then another. Life continued. Work deadlines, weekend routines, the quiet rhythm of a life that doesn't draw attention. Then came the second moment. My brother called me late one night. Not unusual. His calls were always unscheduled, always urgent in tone, even when the issue wasn't. He asked how things were going. Small talk. Then, almost as an afterthought, he said, "Hey, random question. Did you ever freeze your credit?" The word freeze landed heavier than it should have. I told him no. Asked why. "Oh, no reason," he said quickly. "Just something I heard on a podcast. You know, identity theft stuff. Figured you'd be into that." He laughed. I laughed. We hung up. I remember standing in my kitchen afterward, phone still in my hand, staring at nothing in particular. That whisper again. Louder this time. Still not a scream. I checked my credit report the next morning. There it was. One credit card account I didn't recognize. Opened 3 months earlier. Low balance. Paid on time. No missed payments. If someone had designed a fraudulent account to stay invisible, this is exactly how it would look. I told myself it was a mistake. I called the issuer, waited on hold, verified my identity. The representative read off details from the application. My name, my SSN, my address. And then the email. An email address I'd never used. I felt something shift. Not panic, not anger, just a quiet internal recalibration. Like a puzzle piece clicking into place where I hadn't realized there was a gap. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't call my brother. I didn't tell my parents. Instead, I did what I've always done when something doesn't feel right. I documented dates, account numbers, inquiry timestamps, call logs, screenshots. I wrote everything down in my notebook, the same way I tracked budgets and goals. Methodical, emotionless. Because here's what I understood, even then. If this was a mistake, it would resolve cleanly. And if it wasn't, if this was intentional, then reacting emotionally would only teach the other person where the boundaries were. And I wasn't ready to reveal those yet. Everyone else ignored the early signs, or never saw them at all. I saw them. I just didn't announce it. That was the first small cut, not deep enough to bleed, just enough to hurt later. Once you notice a pattern, you start seeing how long it's been forming. After that first card appeared, I became hyper-aware of the small things, not in a paranoid way, but in a calibrated one. I didn't change my behavior. I didn't ask questions that would raise eyebrows. I simply paid attention. And what I noticed was how easily everyone, including me, had normalized a lack of respect. My brother didn't suddenly act guilty. He didn't avoid me or overcompensate. In fact, he seemed more relaxed than usual, almost relieved, like someone who'd crossed a line, realized there were no consequences, and adjusted accordingly. He made comments about money more often, jokes about how banks were stupid, about how credit scores were just a game. Everyone nodded along. It was presented as cynicism, experience, street smarts. I stayed quiet. At one point, he mentioned he'd been helping a friend get approved for something by walking them through paperwork. He said it while looking directly at me, then looked away quickly, as if daring me to react. I didn't. Silence can be mistaken for agreement when people want it to be. The second credit card appeared 2 months later. Same pattern. Small balance, on-time payments, no red flags that would trigger automatic alarms. Whoever did this understood how systems worked, or had learned quickly. That realization stung more than the fraud itself, because it meant this wasn't desperation, it was calculated. Still, I rationalized staying quiet. I told myself confrontation would only escalate things. That maybe there was an explanation. That family didn't do this to each other. Not really. I told myself that if I waited, I'd understand more. Waiting became my excuse. Meanwhile, the tone of my brother's interactions subtly shifted. He spoke to me with a kind of casual authority, like someone who believed they had leverage, even if I hadn't confirmed it yet. He'd ask favors more freely. Can you spot me till Friday? Can you co-sign something real quick? I declined politely, citing policy, procedure, and work rules. He laughed it off. Man, you're always by the book. What he didn't know was that I had started separating emotion from observation. Every interaction became data. The third card came shortly after. That one hurt, not because of the money, but because of the timing. It opened the same week I began the mortgage pre-approval process. The same week, I felt, for the first time, like I was stepping into a new chapter of my life. And while I was planning for the future, someone else was quietly anchoring me to a past I didn't consent to. I remember sitting at my desk late one evening, staring at the screen, realizing something uncomfortable. No one in my family would believe me immediately if I spoke up. Not because they thought I was lying, but because the version of me they held in their minds didn't align with the accusation. I was the stable one, the quiet one, the one who handled things. People don't easily accept disruption from someone they've labeled as non-disruptive. So I stayed quiet. I paid for credit monitoring upgrades. I pulled reports weekly. I watched balances. I saw patterns in spending that mirrored my brother's habits. Gas stations near his place, online retailers he used, charges that lined up with conversations we'd had days earlier. Each confirmation chipped away at denial. And still, I didn't explode, because I realized something crucial during that period. Disrespect doesn't always arrive as an attack. Sometimes it arrives as confidence. Confidence that you won't push back. Confidence that you'll absorb the impact quietly, like you always have. By staying silent, I wasn't just being patient. I was being tested. And I was passing the test in the worst way possible. I wasn't normalizing disrespect because I believed it was acceptable. I was normalizing it because that's what I had been trained to do. Smooth things over, avoid conflict, carry weight others didn't want to feel. What changed wasn't my awareness. What changed was my understanding of what silence actually costs. Because silence isn't neutral. It's an investment. And at this point, I had invested enough to know exactly what kind of return I was getting. It took me a long time to understand that roles don't need to be spoken to be enforced. No one ever sat me down and said, "You're the one who absorbs things." No family meeting, no explicit agreement. It was just assumed, reinforced over years of consistent behavior. Every time I stayed calm, every time I let something slide, every time I chose harmony over honesty, I was the fixer, the stabilizer, the background infrastructure of the family. If someone needed help moving, I was called first. If there was paperwork no one wanted to deal with, it landed in my lap. If a conflict needed de-escalating, I was expected to be the reasonable one. And because I fulfilled that role well, it stopped being appreciated and started being expected. What I began to see, once I allowed myself to see it, was how neatly that role benefited everyone else. My calm gave cover to chaos. My reliability created space for irresponsibility. My silence protected narratives that shouldn't have survived daylight, especially my brother's. He wasn't treated maliciously when things went wrong. He was treated as complicated, misunderstood, temporarily unlucky. There was always an emotional buffer around him. People leaned in, not away. I was the opposite. When something involved me, people leaned back, trusted that I'd handle it, trusted that I didn't need support, trusted that whatever it wasn't that bad. Even now, as I uncovered evidence of financial identity theft, I could predict the responses before they happened. Are you sure? Maybe it's a mix-up. He wouldn't do that to you. Not because they knew the facts, but because they knew the roles. And my role wasn't an accuser. It was resolved. That realization was quietly devastating, because it meant the theft itself wasn't the core injury. The core injury was knowing that if I exposed it too early, I'd be asked to manage everyone else's discomfort about it. I'd be expected to soften the truth, to explain it kindly, to frame it in a way that preserved the family's emotional balance. I would become the caretaker of the consequences, again. So I didn't speak. Instead, I started redefining my role privately. I stopped being emotionally available in the ways people were used to. I still showed up, still helped when asked, but I no longer volunteered extra. I no longer filled silence with reassurance. That shift went unnoticed. People rarely notice when you stop giving what they never thanked you for. My brother, meanwhile, grew bolder. He talked openly about financial pressure, about needing temporary solutions. He framed his choices as survival, cleverness, adaptation. He told stories where systems were enemies and bending rules was intelligence. And in those stories, I was never a person. I was a resource. That's a hard thing to accept about someone who shares your last name. I remember one conversation in particular. He said, half joking, "If you ever get rich, I'm retiring early." He nudged my arm, laughed. I smiled. But inside, something clicked into place with cold clarity. I wasn't a brother in his mind. I was a safety net, a backup plan, a structure he could lean on without asking permission. And structures don't get consent. They get used. That's when I understood the role I'd been assigned wasn't accidental, and it wouldn't end unless I ended it. Not with confrontation, not with anger, but by stepping out of character, quietly. The day everything shifted didn't come with a confrontation. There was no argument, no raised voices, no dramatic discovery scene. It came in the form of an email. I was sitting at my desk at work mid-morning, coffee going cold beside me. I'd been expecting the message, had even refreshed my inbox once or twice. But when it arrived, it still felt strangely unreal. "We regret to inform you that your mortgage application has been denied." That was the subject line. At first, I assumed it was procedural, a missing document, a verification issue, something temporary. I opened it calmly, already mentally drafting a follow-up call. Then I read the reason. Debt-to-income ratio exceeded acceptable limits. Multiple revolving credit accounts recently opened. Multiple. Recently. My chest tightened, not with panic, but with recognition. The kind that settles in when a theory becomes fact. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. The office around me continued as normal, keyboards clicking, a phone ringing somewhere down the hall. No one noticed anything was wrong. Why would they? I was still quiet, still composed, still playing my part. But something fundamental had changed. This wasn't abstract anymore. This wasn't a line item on a credit report I could watch from a distance. This was my future being rerouted without my consent. A house I'd already walked through, a neighborhood I'd imagined living in, a life step I'd planned carefully for years, blocked by actions I hadn't taken. That was the moment denial became impossible. Not emotional denial, structural denial. The system had weighed my life and found it riskier because someone else had decided my identity was usable. I didn't call my brother. I didn't call my parents. I didn't even respond to the lender right away. Instead, I closed my office door and opened my notebook. For the first time, I didn't just document facts. I wrote a sentence at the top of the page. This is no longer something I can absorb quietly. That sentence didn't make me angry. It made it clear. Clarity is different from rage. Rage wants release. Clarity wants direction. I spent the rest of that day reviewing everything. Every account, every charge, every inquiry. I lined timelines up against memories, conversations, jokes, comments I'd brushed off. The pattern was undeniable now, and something else surfaced alongside it. Grief. Not for the money. Not even for the delayed house. Grief for the versions of myself that believed being low maintenance kept you safe. I realized that I had confused being calm with being protected. That by not asserting boundaries, I had taught people there weren't any. That night, I went for a long walk. No music, no phone, just the sound of my footsteps and the city settling into the evening. I thought about confrontation, what it would look like, how it would feel. I imagined the denials, the excuses, the emotional deflection. I imagined being asked to forgive quickly, to move on, to keep things from getting messy. And for the first time, I understood something deeply. If I confronted him now, I would still be managing the situation for everyone else. So I made a different choice. I decided that silence, real silence, would become intentional. Not avoidance, strategy. I would let systems speak where emotions had failed. I would let documentation replace accusation. I would stop explaining myself to people who benefited from misunderstanding me. This wasn't revenge, it wasn't punishment. It was alignment. From that moment on, every action I took would serve one purpose: restoring truth to places where comfort had replaced it. Quietly, precisely, legally. The man who walked back into his apartment that night wasn't louder than the one who'd left that morning, but he was no longer willing to disappear for anyone. There's a difference between being quiet because you're afraid to speak and being quiet because you know exactly what you're doing. Until that point, my silence had been passive, habitual, almost reflexive. I stayed quiet because it felt easier, cleaner, less disruptive. But after the mortgage denial, silence became something else entirely. It became deliberate. I didn't withdraw from my family. I didn't act cold or distant. From the outside, nothing changed. I still showed up to dinners, still answered messages, still nodded at jokes that didn't deserve laughter. That was the most unsettling part, how normal everything looked. My brother had no idea that anything had shifted. He still spoke freely around me, still joked about finances, still treated my stability like a renewable resource. He assumed my quiet meant ignorance or tolerance. He was wrong on both counts. Behind the scenes, I froze my credit. I placed fraud alerts with all 3 bureaus. I requested full, detailed reports, historical data, archived inquiries, everything. I contacted each issuer involved and began the process of formal disputes, careful to follow the procedure precisely. No threats, no accusations, just paperwork. I learned very quickly that systems respond better to calm than to outrage. Forms don't care about betrayal. They care about dates, signatures, and consistency. And I had all 3. I also stopped shielding my brother in subtle ways I hadn't realized I'd been doing. When family conversations drifted toward his latest financial drama, I no longer offered explanations on his behalf. I didn't minimize. I didn't soften. I simply stayed neutral. People noticed, not consciously but instinctively. When the usual buffer disappears, tension becomes visible. My brother mistook my restraint for weakness. He started pushing more. Small things at first, asking again about co-signing, hinting about needing help with applications. He spoke as if the window was still open. Each time I declined politely, firmly, without justification. No, that doesn't work for me. That sentence felt unfamiliar in my mouth. Heavy, clean. He laughed it off, but I saw the flicker behind his eyes. Confusion, frustration, something else too. Uncertainty. People who rely on your predictability panic when they can't predict you anymore. Meanwhile, I kept building my case. I requested copies of applications, IP addresses, recorded calls, delivery addresses, every detail that tied behavior to intent. I didn't rush. I didn't skip steps. This wasn't about speed. It was about making sure that when the truth surfaced, it didn't need defending. What surprised me most during this phase wasn't my brother's behavior. It was my own emotional state. I wasn't angry. I wasn't anxious. I felt steady, like someone who'd finally stopped leaking energy into a situation that didn't deserve it. Silence, when chosen, is powerful. It forces others to project, to fill gaps, to reveal themselves without being prompted. And my brother did. He grew sloppier, more careless with language. He complained about banks cracking down, about someone making things harder than they needed to be. He never looked at me when he said it. I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because by then, silence wasn't absence. It was pressure. Pressure applied not through confrontation, but through inevitability. Every document I filed, every record I preserved, every process I followed moved the situation forward without my brother's participation or awareness. That's the thing about systems. They don't need permission to work. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying someone else's weight to keep things comfortable. I was letting truth do its job, quietly. What they never noticed was how much I was learning. Not just about credit systems or fraud protocols, I already understood those, but about people, about patterns, about how long someone can operate unchecked when the person being exploited refuses to change character. From the outside, my life looked unchanged. Same routines, same tone, same posture in rooms. That was intentional. Familiarity is camouflage. When people think they know you, they stop watching closely. My brother, especially, stopped watching. He assumed the absence of confrontation meant the absence of awareness. He assumed my silence meant confusion, or perhaps denial. That assumption bought me time, and time is leverage when you know how to use it. I learned exactly how credit card fraud investigations progress. Not from blogs or guesswork, but from speaking calmly with representatives whose job was to handle this every day. I asked the right questions. I took notes. I followed escalation paths without emotional language. I learned which departments recorded calls and how long those recordings were retained. I learned what triggered internal reviews and what caused cases to stall. I learned the difference between a complaint and a report, and which one mattered more. Most importantly, I learned patience. I also learned something else, something more uncomfortable. My brother wasn't improvising anymore. Early on, I might have believed this started as a moment of panic, a bad month, a poor decision. But the deeper I went, the clearer it became that this had evolved into a system of its own. The cards were used just enough to stay active. Payments were made just enough to avoid flags. Addresses were updated with precision. Even spending patterns suggested someone intentionally blended into my financial profile. He had studied me. He knew my habits, my conservatism, my credit hygiene. He understood that if he behaved the way I behaved, the system wouldn't react. That realization reframed our entire relationship. I stopped thinking of this as something done to me and started seeing it as something built on me. And still, no one noticed. My parents spoke about him with concern, not suspicion. They worried about his stress levels, his luck, and his bad timing. They spoke about me with relief. At least Mark is stable. At least Mark doesn't have these problems. I listened, and I understood how narratives survive, not because they're true, but because they're convenient. While those narratives held, I prepared. I created a timeline that didn't rely on memory. Dates cross-referenced with transactions, locations tied to charges, digital footprints that told a story no one could explain away with emotion. I kept everything factual. No adjectives, no speculation. Facts don't argue. They wait. I also spoke with a housing counselor, not to complain, but to understand. To map out what would need to happen for my mortgage application to be reconsidered once the fraud was resolved. The answer was simple and brutal. Time. Time to unwind accounts. Time for corrections to propagate. Time for trust to be restored. That was the cost. And for the first time, I allowed myself to feel it. Not in anger, but in resolve. I realized that every day I stayed silent before had been a subsidy. I had been paying in patience, in stability, in lost opportunity, and no one had ever asked if I was willing to keep paying. They just assumed I would. What they never noticed was that I had stopped subsidizing them. I began setting internal boundaries that didn't need announcements. I stopped sharing details about my life, stopped offering updates. I became opaque where I had once been transparent. People often think opacity is secrecy. It isn't. It's privacy reclaimed. My brother noticed that I'd changed, but he misread the reason. He thought I was stressed, or distracted, or quietly struggling. He had no idea that while he was operating on familiarity, I was operating on certainty. Certainty doesn't rush. Certainty doesn't posture. Certainty prepares. And by the time anyone realized I was no longer the invisible infrastructure holding things together, the structure had already been redesigned. Without them. The private reveal didn't happen all at once. There was no single document slid across a table. No cinematic moment where everything suddenly made sense. It unfolded quietly, in pieces, each one confirming what I already knew, but grounding it so firmly in reality that doubt could no longer survive. The clearest moment came during a routine follow-up call with one of the credit card issuers. The representative had been calm, professional, detached. We were walking through verification steps when she paused, just for a second longer than usual. Then she said, carefully, "Sir, the device used to apply for this account has been used before." I asked her to clarify. She explained that the same device fingerprint, browser configuration, operating system, IP behavior had appeared in multiple applications tied to different names. Not mine, not legally. She couldn't tell me which names, privacy policy, but she didn't need to, because the location data matched a place I knew well. My brother's apartment. That was the moment everything crystallized. Not emotionally, but structurally. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't an overlap. This wasn't shared space confusion or clerical error. This was repetition. Intent repeated becomes identity. I thanked her, hung up, sat in silence for a long time. Not shaking, not angry, just still. What surprised me wasn't the confirmation. It was the absence of shock. I had already done the emotional work of acceptance. The system was simply catching up. From that point on, every new piece of information felt less like discovery and more like alignment. I received copies of signed applications. The handwriting wasn't mine, but it was familiar. the cadence of the letters, the pressure points. I'd seen it on birthday cards, notes on the fridge growing up. I didn't feel disgust. I felt clarity. Clarity is strangely unemotional. It doesn't ask why anymore. It just asks what comes next. And what came next was understanding my leverage, not in the manipulative sense, not in the revenge fantasy sense, but in the factual sense of knowing where reality stood and where it was heading, with or without me. I had documented fraud across multiple institutions. I had corroborating data. I had timestamps, locations, device correlations, behavioral patterns. I also had something else, restraint. I hadn't tipped anyone off. I hadn't escalated emotionally. I hadn't threatened or warned, which meant there was no opportunity for preemptive narratives, no time for damage control, no rehearsed remorse. The truth was intact, and because it was intact, it was powerful. Still, I didn't celebrate. There was no sense of victory in knowing someone you trusted had built something at your expense. There was only a sober recognition that pretending otherwise would cost me more. That night, my brother texted me, "Hey man, you good? You've been quiet lately." I stared at the message for a long time. Then I typed back, "Yeah, just busy." It was the truth, just not the one he thought he was asking about. I realized then that this was the last phase where I had the luxury of invisibility. Once I took the next steps, consequences would ripple outward. Conversations would change, perceptions would shift. There was no way to correct the record without breaking the illusion. And illusions, once broken, don't come back. So I asked myself a hard question, one I hadn't allowed myself to ask before. If nothing changed from this point on, what would I be teaching people about how I expect to be treated? The answer was simple and unacceptable. So I made a decision, privately, without ceremony. I would stop protecting a version of peace that only existed because I paid for it. I would let systems move forward. I would let facts surface. I would let outcomes occur naturally, without softening their impact. Not out of cruelty, out of self-respect. The reveal wasn't something I announced. It was something I prepared for. And once you see the truth clearly enough, the next step stops feeling like a choice. It feels like alignment catching up to reality. There's a moment in every long, quiet crisis where waiting stops being patience and starts becoming avoidance. I reached that moment alone, sitting at my kitchen table late one night, documents spread out in front of me like pieces of a map. Every path was visible now, every option is clear, and none of them were comfortable. I could confront my brother privately, lay everything out, give him a chance to explain, apologize, maybe even fix things quietly. That path would keep the family calm, at least on the surface. It would preserve the image of unity that everyone relied on. But I knew how that would end. There would be tears, rationalizations, promises, a rush to move past it for the sake of family. I would be asked, implicitly or explicitly, to slow things down, to withdraw reports, to protect him from consequences that felt too harsh. And in doing so, I would once again become the caretaker of someone else's choices. Another option was to do nothing further, absorb the damage, rebuild my credit quietly over time, delay the house, swallow the loss, and move on. That path was tempting in a way that scared me. It offered silence, familiarity, the comfort of not disrupting anything. It asked only that I continue being who I'd always been. But that option came with a cost I could no longer ignore. It would teach everyone, including myself, that my boundaries were negotiable, that my future was flexible when it conflicted with someone else's convenience, that I would always choose peace over truth, even when peace was built on deception. There was a third option, one that didn't involve shouting or threats or emotional bargaining, one that didn't require me to convince anyone of anything. I could let the process continue, file the remaining affidavits, cooperate fully with investigations, allow institutions to do what they were designed to do when fraud is documented and verified. This option wasn't dramatic, but it was irreversible. Once it moved forward, outcomes would follow their own timelines. Accounts would be closed, responsibility would be assigned, records would be corrected, and explanations would be demanded, not from me, but from the person whose actions had triggered everything. That's what made this choice different. It removed me from the center of the conflict. No mediator, no buffer, no emotional shock absorber, just reality unfolding. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about my parents, about how they'd react, about how difficult it would be to accept that one son had harmed the other in such a concrete way. I thought about holidays, conversations that would never sound the same again. And I thought about myself, 5 years from now, looking back at this moment. Would I be proud of choosing comfort over clarity? Or would I regret not standing firmly in my own life when it mattered most? The answer came quietly, without drama. I signed the final documents the next morning. Not angrily, not triumphantly. Calmly. With the same hand I used to sign tax returns, contracts, and loan applications. The same steady handwriting I'd used my whole life. As I dropped the envelope into the mail slot, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because things were over. They weren't. But because the decision was. From that point forward, I wasn't managing outcomes. I wasn't predicting reactions. I wasn't rehearsing conversations. I had chosen alignment over accommodation. Whatever came next would come honestly. And for the first time since the mortgage denial, I slept deeply. Not because the situation was resolved, but because I had stopped betraying myself to keep others comfortable. Some decisions don't announce themselves as brave. They just quietly change the direction of your life. Once the decision was made, everything moved, just not in ways anyone around me could see. That's the strange thing about accountability. When it's done properly, it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't posture. It doesn't threaten. It just advances, step by step, form by form, timestamp by timestamp. From the outside, my life still looked quiet, predictable, unchanged. But underneath, systems had begun turning. I responded promptly to every request from investigators. I provided documentation without commentary. I answered questions without editorializing. When asked if I suspected anyone in particular, I stated facts, not names, locations, access, patterns. Let conclusions be drawn where they belonged. I also worked with the lender to formally suspend my mortgage application, not withdraw it. That distinction mattered. Suspension meant intent to resume once conditions were corrected. Withdrawal would have implied fault. Words matter in systems. I learned to use them carefully. At the same time, I began rebuilding, not emotionally, but structurally. I adjusted timelines, reworked plans, found a short-term rental extension instead of rushing into another application. I refused to let urgency force me into poor decisions. There was no panic buying, no scrambling, just recalibration. My brother sensed something, not specifics, but resistance. He mentioned that banks were acting weird lately. Those applications were taking longer. Those things weren't lining up like they used to. I listened, nodded, said nothing. People often reveal their awareness before they understand their exposure. Family gatherings continued. Conversations floated over safe topics. Work, weather, mutual acquaintances. The unspoken tension grew, not because I created it, but because I stopped dissolving it. That absence was noticeable. My parents asked if everything was okay. I told them yes, which was true, in the way that mattered. I didn't burden them with half-truths. I didn't preemptively justify what they didn't yet need to know. I trusted timing. Meanwhile, letters began arriving. Not to me, but elsewhere. Requests for verification, notices of account closures, formal correspondence that doesn't ask for feelings, only answers. My brother didn't say anything at first. Then he started fishing. Casual questions, hypotheticals. What would you do if someone messed up your credit? Do you think people deserve second chances for financial mistakes? I answered honestly, but generally. Depends on intent, I said once. Yeah, you saw us on Thomas. And accountability. He didn't like that answer. The more pressure built, the quieter I became. Not withdrawn, not hostile. Precise. Silence, when paired with inevitability, is unnerving. It offers no friction to push against, no argument to win, no emotional angle to exploit. I wasn't hiding. I was simply no longer participating in the illusion that everything could stay the same. That's what moving in silence really is, not secrecy, but discipline. It's choosing not to telegraph your steps to people who would only use that information to delay consequences. And consequences were now in motion. I could feel it in the air, in the way conversations hesitated. In the meantime, my brother stopped joking around me, in the way he avoided eye contact when finances came up. He knew something was wrong. He just didn't know how much. I stayed grounded by reminding myself of one thing. I didn't cause this process. I didn't design the outcome. I simply stopped interfering with reality. And reality, once allowed to function, doesn't need help being fair. Consequences rarely arrive with the clarity people imagine. They don't show up as a single dramatic event. They arrive unevenly. Small disruptions at first, subtle enough to be dismissed, then steadily impossible to ignore. The first sign wasn't anger or confrontation. It was an inconvenience. My brother started complaining more. About hold times, about paperwork, about how nothing ever works the way it's supposed to. He framed it as bad luck, as usual, a run of obstacles stacked unfairly against him. But the tone was different. There was no bravado anymore, no jokes about outsmarting systems, just irritation, thinly veiled and poorly contained. He mentioned a credit card being frozen for no reason. Then another. He said a bank wanted extra verification. that they were asking questions that didn't make sense. I listened. When someone is used to operating without resistance, the smallest friction feels like injustice. At family dinners, his mood shifted. He was shorter with people, defensive, easily frustrated. The rest of the family noticed something was off, but not why. They attributed it to stress, to work, to money. The usual explanations. No one looked at me. I was still playing my old role on the surface. Calm, neutral, present. But I wasn't absorbing anything anymore. The second phase of consequences came quietly, and it hit deeper. My brother stopped making plans, stopped talking about the future. He became vague, non-committal. His confidence drained not all at once, but in layers. I recognized the pattern because I'd seen it in clients before. This was what it looked like when someone realized the system was no longer responding the way it used to, when shortcuts stopped working, when assumptions expired. One evening, he pulled me aside after dinner, not to confess, to probe. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice low, "you ever deal with fraud stuff at work?" I met his eyes calmly. "Sometimes." He nodded, hesitated. "It's messy, right? Like, once it starts, it's hard to stop?" That was the moment I understood something important. He knew, not everything, but enough. Enough to feel the ground shifting beneath him. I didn't answer the question the way he wanted. "It depends," I said. "How long it been going on?" He didn't press further. He didn't need to, because the consequences weren't coming from me. They were coming from systems that don't negotiate. Letters arrived, phone calls increased, requests for documentation multiplied. Each one pulled another thread loose. Each one required an explanation he couldn't cleanly provide. And here's the part people don't talk about. Consequences isolate before they punish. My brother began pulling away from the family, not out of guilt, but out of exhaustion. Keeping stories straight takes energy. Maintaining denial requires constant vigilance. Silence from me removed his reference point. He didn't know what I knew. He didn't know what I'd submitted. He didn't know what was coming next. That uncertainty did more damage than confrontation ever could have. I watched all of this without satisfaction. There was no thrill in seeing someone unravel, no sense of victory. Only a quiet confirmation that choosing alignment over accommodation had been necessary. Because once accountability starts, it doesn't ask for permission to finish. I continued cooperating, continued responding, continued rebuilding my own path forward in parallel. And slowly, inevitably, the imbalance corrected itself. Not through force, through exposure. The truth doesn't need volume. It needs time. By the time panic set in, it was already too late. That's the thing people misunderstand about consequences. They imagine a window where apologies can rewind damage, where regret, if expressed sincerely enough, can pause momentum. But systems don't work that way. Once processes cross certain thresholds, intent becomes irrelevant. My brother crossed that threshold long before he realized it existed. The first real crack appeared when he tried to fix things quietly. He didn't come to me, not yet. Instead, he started scrambling behind the scenes, calling banks, asking about clerical errors, claiming misunderstandings. He was used to problems resolving themselves once enough noise was applied. This time, noise only attracted scrutiny. Requests for verification escalated into requests for explanation. Explanations triggered inconsistencies. Inconsistencies triggered reviews. What he didn't understand was that his earlier confidence, the precision with which he'd operated, was now working against him. Patterns that once kept him invisible were now evidence of intent. You can't undo intent retroactively. At family gatherings, the atmosphere changed. My parents began exchanging looks when my brother spoke. Concern crept into conversations where reassurance used to live. They didn't know the full story yet, but they could feel something collapsing. He became volatile, defensive one moment, withdrawn the next. He snapped at small things, over-explained others. Every reaction betrayed pressure. And still, he didn't come to me. Not because he didn't suspect, but because he wasn't ready to face the one person he'd underestimated for years. Eventually, the calls came more frequently. I could hear them through the walls when we were both at my parents' place. Fragments of conversation, raised voices, long silences. One evening, I walked into the kitchen and found him staring at his phone, pale. "They're saying accounts are being closed permanently," he muttered. Not to me, just out loud. I poured myself a glass of water. He looked up. "Do you know anything about this?" That was the moment he tried to pull me back into my old role. The fixer, the explainer, the stabilizer. I met his eyes. "No," I said calmly, which was true, in the only way that mattered. Because I wasn't managing his situation. I wasn't involved in his calls. I wasn't intervening. I had removed myself from responsibility for outcomes I didn't create. That terrified him. He started bargaining, not explicitly, but emotionally. Talking about stress, about how hard things had been, about mistakes people make when they're under pressure. He was testing whether guilt could still soften boundaries. It couldn't, not because I was cruel, but because it was too late for softness to matter. Once consequences enter the legal and financial record, sentiment becomes irrelevant. I could see it dawning on him slowly, that whatever was happening was bigger than a private conversation, bigger than family mediation, bigger than excuses. He stopped sleeping. I could tell. His eyes were sunken. His movements are restless. He checked his phone compulsively, waiting for updates that never brought relief. And then, finally, he asked the question he'd been avoiding. What did you tell them? I didn't answer right away. Not to punish him, but to choose precision. I told the truth, I said, when asked. He stared at me, searching for anger, for triumph, for something he could react to. There was nothing. Just calm. That's when he understood the part he couldn't undo. This wasn't a fight. It was a record. And records don't bend for emotion. By the time regret arrived, real regret, not strategic remorse, it had no leverage left. Some damage can be apologized for. Some can be forgiven, but some can only be documented. And documentation, once filed, doesn't care how sorry you are. The confrontation didn't happen the way people expect confrontations to happen. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no dramatic confessions under pressure. It happened on a quiet afternoon at my parents' house when everyone else was out. Just the two of us sitting at the kitchen table where we'd eaten 1,000 ordinary meals growing up. My brother spoke first. I know it was you. His voice wasn't angry, it was tired, stripped of performance. All the confidence he'd once carried had burned away under the weight of consequences. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't think it would go this far, he continued. I thought I could fix it before it mattered. That sentence told me everything. Not remorse for what he'd done, but surprise that it had reached reality. I nodded once, not in agreement, in acknowledgement. I didn't make it go anywhere, I said calmly. I stopped stopping it. He flinched at that, not because it was harsh, but because it was accurate. He tried to explain himself, not dramatically, just enough to see if context would soften the outcome. Stress, fear, a sense of falling behind. He said he never meant to hurt me. I listened, and when he finished, I said something that surprised even me with how little emotion it carried. Intent doesn't erase impact. There was a long silence after that. He asked why I hadn't come to him sooner. Why hadn't he warned him? I told him the truth. Because every time I stayed quiet before, it taught you that you could go further. That landed. Not like an accusation, but like a diagnosis. He looked down at his hands. The same hands I'd trusted without thinking. The same handwriting I'd recognized on those applications. I didn't think you'd ever do this, he said. I met his eyes. That's the problem. For the first time, he saw me. Not as a background presence, not as a safety net, but as a person with limits. And he didn't like it, but he understood it. We didn't resolve anything that day. There was nothing to resolve. The processes were already in motion, outcomes already unfolding. What that conversation did was remove illusion. No more pretending this was a misunderstanding. No more framing it as bad luck or miscommunication. Just clarity. Before he left, he asked one final question. Is there anything you can do to stop it? I answered honestly, no. Not because I didn't care, but because undoing truth to preserve comfort would have been another betrayal, this time of myself. He nodded slowly, stood up, left without another word, and that was it. No explosion, no closure wrapped in forgiveness or fury, just the quiet end of a version of our relationship that had been unsustainable for a long time. After everything settled, after the calls slowed, after the letters stopped arriving, after the tension no longer hovered in the background like unfinished business, I expected to feel lighter. Instead, I felt clearer. There's a difference. Lightness implies release. Clarity implies responsibility. It means you see things as they are, without cushioning or distortion, and you accept what that requires of you going forward. I am no longer the person who confuses calm with consent. That shift didn't make me colder. It made me more precise. I still value peace. I still choose restraint over reaction. But now my quietness has edges. It has a definition. It doesn't blur into availability the way it used to. People noticed the change, not immediately and not dramatically, but over time, interactions adjusted. Requests became actual requests again. Assumptions softened. Conversations paused where they once rushed past me. Boundaries, I learned, don't need announcements. They teach people how to treat you simply by existing. My relationship with my family changed. Not explosively, not beyond repair, but permanently. There are things we don't avoid, but we also don't gloss over anymore. There's an awareness now, a gravity where there used to be casualness. As for my brother, we're distant, not estranged in a dramatic sense, just accurate. The relationship is no longer built on what I provide or absorb. It exists within the limits of trust as it actually stands. That honesty is quieter than forgiveness, but more durable. I eventually reapplied for a mortgage, later than planned, with documentation attached, with explanations already anticipated. The approval came without celebration, just confirmation that patience, paired with truth, works. The house I bought wasn't the one I originally wanted. It was better, not because of the layout or the location, but because I stepped into it without carrying someone else's weight with me. I didn't tell this story to make a point about my brother. I told it to make a point about roles, about what happens when you let people define you by what you're willing to tolerate, about how being easy can slowly erase your agency if you never reassert it. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about alignment. It's about letting your actions reflect your values, even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable. I still keep my notebook, not because I expect trouble, but because it reminds me who I am when things matter. Someone who pays attention, someone who doesn't rush for clarity, someone who no longer disappears to keep others comfortable. That's who I am now. There's a temptation, when a story like this ends, to search for a lesson that feels clean and comforting. Something like family always comes first, or forgiveness fixes everything, or standing up for yourself solves the problem. But real life doesn't resolve itself into slogans. It leaves you with quieter truths, ones that are harder to post on a wall but easier to live by once you accept them. The truth I walked away with is this: silence is never neutral. When it's chosen consciously, it can be powerful, strategic, protective. But when it's inherited, when it becomes a role you play without examining who benefits from it, it slowly trains people how far they're allowed to go with you, and they will go as far as you let them. Not because they're evil, not always because they intend harm, but because unchecked behavior doesn't correct itself. It escalates, it adapts, it assumes. Another uncomfortable truth is that accountability feels like betrayal to people who relied on your tolerance. When you stop absorbing damage quietly, when you stop cushioning consequences, it doesn't look like growth to those who benefited from the old version of you. It looks like coldness, like punishment, like abandonment. That doesn't mean you're wrong. It means the dynamic was never balanced. I didn't lose a brother because I told the truth. I lost an illusion that I could protect someone from the consequences of their actions without sacrificing myself in the process. And I gained something far more durable in return: self-respect that doesn't need validation. This story wasn't about revenge. There was no moment where I won. No scene where justice felt cinematic or satisfying in the way movies promise. What there was instead was alignment. I stopped bending reality to preserve comfort. I let systems do the work. Emotions couldn't. And I learned that choosing yourself doesn't require cruelty, just consistency. If you take anything from this, let it be this: you are not responsible for managing other people's reactions to the truth. You are only responsible for not lying to yourself to keep the peace. Quiet strength doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need witnesses. It simply refuses to disappear anymore. Before I go, I want to ask you something. Not rhetorically, but genuinely. Have you ever been cast as the stable one, the easy one, the person who absorbs everything until it costs you something important? If so, I'd really like to hear your story in the comments. Because silence is powerful, but shared experience is how we remind each other we're not alone.